A single gunshot shattered a boy's world. His beloved pony senselessly killed. When a corrupt HOA official's vendetta goes too far, his sheriff father ignites a town's fury. He promised justice for an innocent life taken. But can one grieving father, facing entrenched power and deceit, truly make them pay? You won't believe how far they pushed him. Stay tuned for a fight that will grip your heart. The first shot shattered the morning's tranquility, a percussive crack that ripped through the crisp autumn air and sent a flock of crows scattering from the skeletal branches of the ancient oak at the edge of Mark Halston's property. Mark, mid-sip of his coffee on the porch, froze. That wasn't a deer rifle. Not at this range. It was closer. Too close. Another shot followed, sharper this time, accompanied by the panicked, high-pitched whinny of a horse. Biscuit, a cold dread, sharp and swift, pierced through Mark. He slammed his mug down, the hot liquid sloshing over his hand, and vaulted off the porch, his boots hitting the packed earth with a thud. "Tommy!" he roared, his voice tight with a sudden, sickening fear. His 9-year-old son, Tommy, was supposed to be in the paddock, giving Biscuit his morning oats. The small, gentle Palomino pony was more than just a pet. He was Tommy's confidant, his shadow, his four-legged best friend. Mark had bought Biscuit for Tommy's 8th birthday, a tiny foal then, and the two had been inseparable ever since. He rounded the corner of the barn just as a third shot rang out. The sight that greeted him stole the air from his lungs. Tommy was on the ground, halfway between the house and the paddock, his small hands clasped over his ears, his face a mask of terror. And in the paddock, Biscuit lay on his side, his beautiful cream coat already darkening with a spreading stain. 3 men, dressed in garish orange hunting vests, stood near the fence line, their rifles still aimed. "Get away from him." Mark's voice was a guttural snarl he barely recognized as his own. As sheriff of Clayton County, he'd faced down armed men before, stared into the cold eyes of killers. But this was different. This was his son, his land, his horse. The men lowered their rifles, a flicker of surprise. Then arrogance. In their eyes, one of them, a portly man with a florid face, gestured dismissively. "Just animal control. Sheriff, HOA authorized." Mark barely heard him. He was already moving, his long strides eating up the distance to his son. He knelt, pulling Tommy into his arms, shielding his eyes from the gruesome scene in the paddock. Tommy was trembling. Small, choked sobs racking his body. "Daddy! Biscuit! They shot Biscuit!" Over Tommy's heaving shoulder. Mark's gaze, cold as glacial ice, fixed on the hunters. "HOA authorized," he repeated, his voice dangerously low. "On my private property, without my consent." Clayton Creek, the small town he presided over, was mostly rural, a patchwork of farms and small holdings like his own. The relatively new Homestead Owners Association was a contentious entity, largely the brainchild of a few overzealous residents in the newer, more suburban developments on the town's edge, led by the notoriously officious Karen Wethers. Mark had his own acreage, a legacy from his grandfather. Well outside their usual purview, or so he'd thought, the portly hunter, clearly the leader, puffed out his chest. "We got a permit, signed and sealed, complaint about feral animals, said they were a nuisance, potentially dangerous. We're just doing our job." He held out a piece of paper. Mark didn't take it. His eyes flicked to the still form in the paddock, the gentle curve of Biscuit's neck now unnaturally limp. Feral Biscuit wouldn't hurt a fly. He was a registered, purebred pony, meticulously cared for. An animal who would nuzzle your hand for a carrot and follow Tommy around like a devoted puppy. "That pony," Mark said, his voice shaking with barely suppressed rage, "was a child's pet, and you're on my land. The permit covers a wider designated zone for animal control due to recent complaints." Another hunter, younger and lankier, chimed in, less confident than his companion. Karen Wethers herself signed off on it, said the Halston property was included. Karen Wethers, of course. A woman who seemed to thrive on petty power and control. A woman who had once tried to cite Mark because the paint on his mailbox was, in her opinion, historically inaccurate for the region. Mark had dismissed her then as a harmless, if irritating, busybody. He'd underestimated her. He'd gravely underestimated her capacity for malicious interference. Get off my property. Each word was a chip of ice. Mark stood, carefully helping Tommy to his feet, keeping the boy tucked behind him. Now, and you can tell Karen Wethers I'll be seeing her. The hunters, perhaps sensing they had overstepped, or perhaps finally registering the barely leashed fury in the sheriff's eyes, began to back away. Look, Sheriff, no harm intended to the kid's horse specifically, the portly one mumbled, the earlier bravado deflating. Just following orders, the HOA. I know who gives the orders, Mark cut him off, and I know who's responsible. He watched them retreat, his jaw clenched so tight it ached. Only when their truck rumbled away down his long driveway did he turn his full attention back to the devastating reality. He walked slowly towards the paddock, Tommy trailing silently behind him, his small hand gripping Mark's belt. Biscuit was gone. The light in his usually bright, intelligent eyes had dimmed. Mark knelt, his hand gently stroking the pony's soft muzzle, the velvety fur already cooling. A wave of profound sadness, mixed with a white-hot anger, washed over him. This wasn't just the loss of an animal. It was an act of calculated cruelty, a violation. Tommy's small voice, thick with tears, whispered, "Why? Daddy, why did they shoot Biscuit?" Mark pulled his son close, his own eyes stinging. "I don't know, son," he said, his voice hoarse. "But I promise you, I'm going to find out. And the people responsible for this, they're going to answer for it." The idyllic peace of their farm had been shattered, replaced by a grief that was raw and a resolve that was hardening into steel. The core of the problem was clear Karen Wethers and her abuse of the HOA's perceived power. She had, whether through malice or gross negligence, signed a death warrant for a beloved family pet. And Mark Halston, as a father and as the sheriff, was about to bring the fight to her doorstep. The quiet life he cherished was over. A storm was brewing in Clayton Creek, and he was standing right in its path. He could already hear the whispers starting, the outrage that would soon ripple through their tight-knit community. This wasn't just about a pony anymore. It was about justice. The hours that followed were a blur of grief and simmering rage for Mark. Burying Biscuit was the hardest thing he'd ever had to help his son do. They chose a spot beneath the old oak tree at the edge of the pasture, a place where Biscuit had often sought shade on hot summer days. Tommy, his face streaked with dirt and tears, placed a small, crudely carved wooden horse, a toy he'd made himself, on the freshly turned earth. He didn't say a word, his silence a heavier burden than any shout. The image of his son, small and heartbroken, patting the grave, seared itself into Mark's mind, a fresh layer of fuel on the fire of his anger. His wife, Sarah, had returned from her nursing shift to the devastating news. Her quiet strength was a balm, but Mark could see the reflection of his own fury in her eyes as she held Tommy. Murmuring words of comfort he couldn't quite bring himself to offer yet. His comfort would come in the form of action. After settling a distraught Tommy into bed, his small hand still clutching a photo of Biscuit, Mark changed into his sheriff's uniform. It wasn't just a grieving father seeking answers anymore. It was the chief law enforcement officer of Clayton County investigating a serious incident. The lines were blurring, but the objective was crystal clear. He drove into the meticulously planned, almost sterile, newer development where Karen Wethers resided. Her house was a two-story beige box, identical to its neighbors, distinguished only by an oversized HOA Community Watch sign planted aggressively in her perfectly manicured lawn. Karen Wethers opened the door, a woman in her late 50s, with a helmet of tightly sprayed blonde hair and eyes that seemed permanently narrowed in suspicion. She was dressed in a pristine pantsuit, even in the evening. Seeing Mark in his uniform, a flicker of something, Surprise, annoyance crossed her face, quickly masked by an air of officious concern. Sheriff Halston, what a surprise. Is there a problem? Her voice was smooth, a little too saccharine. There's a problem, Karen, Mark said, his voice flat, devoid of the usual small-town pleasantries. My son's pony was shot and killed on my property this morning by hunters you authorized. Karen's perfectly plucked eyebrows rose a fraction. Oh, the animal control matter. Yes, a most unfortunate incident. I heard a stray. Wasn't it regrettable, but necessary for the safety of the community? We've had numerous complaints about feral animals in that vicinity. Mark felt his control fray. Feral animals, Karen. That was a 9-year-old boy's registered, purebred Palomino pony. His name was Biscuit, and he was in his own paddock, on private land, miles from your precious manicured lawns. Karen Wethers pursed her lips, a gesture Mark was coming to despise. Sheriff, the designated wildlife management zone was clearly mapped out. Your property, or at least a portion of it bordering the less developed county lands, falls within that extended zone due to the recent influx of reported nuisances. The permit was for the zone, not a specific animal. If your pony was mistaken for a feral threat, it's deeply regrettable. But the HOA and the licensed individuals were operating within the established parameters. She folded her arms, a picture of unyielding bureaucracy. Established by whom? Karen, by you. Mark leaned in slightly. Did you personally inspect these supposed feral animal complaints? Did you verify their legitimacy before signing off on a permit that allowed armed men onto private property, including mine? A faint flush crept up Karen's neck. The HOA has procedures. Sheriff, complaints are logged, actions are taken. We are committed to maintaining the safety and standards of our community. Perhaps if your own property were better fenced, or if the animal had been more clearly marked as domesticated from a distance. The audacity of her victim blaming sent a fresh jolt of anger through Mark. Better fenced marked. He was a gentle pony in his own home. This isn't about fences. Karen, this is about a gross abuse of power and a reckless disregard for life and property. I resent that accusation. Sheriff, Karen said, her voice rising in pitch, losing some of its earlier composure. The HOA acts in good faith. It's a tragic accident. Nothing more. I'm sure the hunters feel terrible. Perhaps your son should learn that animals, even pets, can sometimes be caught in unfortunate circumstances. Mark stared at her, a cold understanding dawning. She wasn't just misinformed or negligent. She was deflecting, twisting the narrative, utterly devoid of empathy. There was a hardness in her, a righteousness that brooked no argument. This was going to be even harder than he thought. This isn't over, Karen, he said, his voice low and steady. Not by a long shot. I'll be looking into those complaints and the exact wording of that permit, and I'll be talking to the hunters again. You do that, Sheriff, Karen said, a hint of a smug smile playing on her lips. You'll find everything is perfectly in order. The HOA stands by its decision. She made to close the door. One more thing, Mark said, his hand implicitly stopping the door's movement. My son is heartbroken, and this town, Karen, this town loves its children. They also value their property rights and their privacy. You might find that order of yours challenged very soon. He turned and walked away, leaving her standing in the doorway. Her mask of composure now visibly cracked as he drove away. His mind raced. She was digging in, relying on the HOA's flimsy legal standing. He needed more than just his word against hers. The next morning, the news of Biscuit's death and the HOA's involvement had begun to ripple through Clayton Creek. Martha, who ran the feed store, called him first, her voice thick with outrage. Mark, I just heard, that Wethers woman, what in Sam Hill was she thinking? Little Tommy must be devastated. Then came calls from other neighbors, farmers mostly, who had little love for the HOA's encroaching regulations. Jed Olson, whose property bordered Mark's to the north, reported seeing the hunter's truck parked carelessly. blocking a portion of his access road. Well before they would have reached Mark's land, they weren't acting like professionals, Mark, Jed said, more like cowboys looking for a thrill. The twist, the escalation Mark hadn't anticipated so soon, came in the form of a tentative email later that afternoon. It was from a resident of Karen Wethers' own development, a quiet woman named Mrs. Henderson, who Mark knew vaguely from church. The email was short, anonymous in its creation, sent from a Proton Mail address, but its content was explosive. Attached was a scanned copy of an internal HOA memo, dated a week before the incident. It was a list of properties flagged for wildlife nuisance observation. Mark's property was on it, but next to his name, in what looked like Karen Wethers' distinctively sharp handwriting, were the added words, Sheriff Halston, known to be uncooperative with HOA guidelines, potential for feral dog/coyote harboring due to unkempt tree line, prioritize for observation and, if necessary, control measures. Feral dogs, coyotes. His tree line was natural woodland, not unkempt. This wasn't just negligence or a broad permit gone wrong. This was targeted. Karen Wethers hadn't just signed a general permit, she'd seemingly highlighted his property, possibly with fabricated justifications. She had painted a target on Biscuit's back. The memo was the first piece of concrete evidence that this was personal, a malicious use of her HOA position to settle a perceived score or to simply exert her authority over the one man in town who represented a different kind of power, one she couldn't control. The fight had just become far more pointed and potentially far more dangerous for Karen Wethers. Mark now had a weapon, and he intended to use it. The community was stirring, and he could feel the tide of their anger beginning to rise alongside his own. The anonymous memo was a smoking gun, or at least, the closest thing to it Mark had. His first call was to the county prosecutor, laying out the situation, the death of Biscuit, the HOA permit, and now the damning internal note. The prosecutor, a pragmatic man named Bill Jensen, listened patiently. While he expressed sympathy, he was cautious. Mark, it's suggestive, highly suggestive even, but Karen's handwriting on an internal memo, proving malicious intent legally based solely on that, is tough. She'll claim it was standard procedure for problematic properties or some other bureaucratic nonsense. We need more. Mark understood. A legal battle would be an uphill climb, but the court of public opinion was another matter entirely. Clayton Creek was a town built on community, on unspoken understandings of respect and decency. Karen Wethers, with her HOA and its clinical, often intrusive, regulations, had always been an outsider in spirit, even if she lived within its newer suburban sprawl. He made a carefully redacted copy of the memo, blurring the sender's details to protect Mrs. Henderson, and showed it to Jed Olson and a few other trusted, influential figures in the older part of town, the ones who had long chafed under the HOA's attempts to extend its reach. Their reaction was immediate and visceral. Old Man Hemlock, a farmer whose family had worked their land for 5 generations, slammed his fist on the counter of the feed store. That woman, she's gone too far this time. This ain't about some damn paint color on a mailbox. This is about right and wrong. The story, now bolstered by the visual of Karen Wethers' own words, seemingly targeting the sheriff, spread like wildfire. It wasn't just whispers anymore. It was open condemnation. People Mark had known his whole life stopped him on the street, offering condolences for Tommy, and more importantly, offering support. Whatever you need, Mark, we're behind you, became a common refrain. A local journalist for the Clayton Creek Chronicle, a young, eager reporter named Sarah Beth Ellison, who usually covered town council meetings and bake sales, caught wind of the escalating situation. She approached Mark, her eyes bright with a mix of sympathy and journalistic fervor. "Sheriff," she said, "I've heard what happened, and I've heard about a certain HOA memo. People are saying this wasn't an accident." Mark, initially wary of sensationalizing his family's pain, saw an opportunity. He gave Sarah Beth a carefully worded statement. confirming the incident, the loss of Biscuit, and his ongoing investigation into the circumstances surrounding the HOA permit. He didn't share the memo directly with Ader yet, but he alluded to troubling inconsistencies in the HOA's justification. Meanwhile, Tommy remained withdrawn. The bright spark in his eyes was gone. He avoided the paddock, flinched at loud noises, and spent hours staring at the photo of Biscuit. Mark's heart ached with every silent display of his son's grief. This, more than anything, solidified his resolve. Justice for Biscuit was inextricably linked to healing for Tommy. The first visible crack in Karen Wethers' armor appeared during an emergency HOA meeting she'd called, ostensibly to address community concerns, but more likely to perform damage control. Mark attended, not in uniform this time, but as a resident, a father. Tommy, quiet and pale, sat beside him, clutching Mark's hand. The meeting room, usually sparsely attended, was packed. Familiar faces from the farming community, people who rarely set foot in the HOA's sterile meeting space, lined the walls, their expressions grim. Karen, flanked by a couple of her loyal HOA board members, looked flustered by the turnout. She began with a prepared statement, reiterating the tragic but unavoidable accident narrative, stressing the HOA's commitment to safety, and subtly trying to paint Mark as over-emotional and uncooperative. When she opened the floor for questions, Jed Olson was the first to speak. "Karen," he said, his voice calm but firm, "that permit you signed, it listed feral animals. My land borders Mark's. I ain't seen a feral dog or a coyote pack in these parts for years. What specific complaints led to that designation for his property?" Karen fumbled with her notes. There were several anonymous reports logged through the HOA portal concerning roaming animals, potential dangers to children in the broader rural-suburban interface. Anonymous reports, Martha from the feed store called out, or a convenient excuse to target someone who doesn't toe your line. "Karen, we've all seen how you operate." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Then, a voice Mark didn't recognize, a nervous-looking man from Karen's own development, stood up. "Mrs. Wethers," he began, his voice trembling slightly. "My son plays near the Halston property line sometimes. He loved seeing that little pony. There was never any danger. But I did receive a notice from the HOA last month about the height of my grass. With a picture you personally took from the street, it felt intrusive, like you were looking for problems." More voices joined in, not just from the farming community, but from within her own HOA ranks. Stories of petty fines, overzealous enforcement of trivial bylaws, and a general feeling of being watched and managed by Karen. The narrative was shifting. This wasn't just Mark Halston's fight anymore. It was a collective airing of grievances against a perceived petty tyrant. The revelation that truly began to unravel Karen's authority came from an unexpected source. One of the hunters, the younger, lankier one who had seemed uneasy at Mark's farm, approached Mark after the meeting. He looked ashamed. "Sheriff," he said quietly, "about that day, Mrs. Wethers, when she gave us the permit, she specifically mentioned your property, said to be extra vigilant around there because she suspected you were harboring strays that might be aggressive. She even offered a bonus for dealing with any nuisances in that specific zone." A bonus. This was the piece Bill Jensen needed. This elevated it from poor judgment to potential inducement, a clear abuse of power for personal reasons. The hunter, clearly regretting his involvement, agreed to give a formal statement. Mark looked at Karen Wethers, who was now visibly pale, her composure crumbling as she faced a room full of angry, disillusioned residents. The power she had wielded with such arrogance was slipping through her fingers. The tide had not just turned, it was threatening to become a tsunami. The community had found its voice, and Mark Halston, the grieving father and resolute sheriff, was no longer standing alone. He was at the head of a growing army demanding accountability. The hidden truth, Karen's personal vendetta and manipulative tactics, was now rapidly coming to light. The hunter's statement was the fulcrum upon which the entire case against Karen Wethers tilted. Armed with this sworn testimony, along with the internal memo and the growing chorus of disgruntled residents, County Prosecutor Bill Jensen finally had the leverage he needed. While criminal charges for animal cruelty against Karen herself were still complex to prove directly for Biscuit's death, as she hadn't pulled the trigger, charges related to abuse of office, malfeasance within the HOA, and potentially conspiracy or incitement related to the bonus for nuisance removal on Mark's property began to look viable. Sarah Beth Ellison, the Clayton Creek Chronicle reporter, broke the story wide open. Her meticulously researched article, featuring anonymized accounts from residents, details from the HOA meeting, and carefully vetted information about the hunter's confession without naming him prematurely to protect the investigation, painted a damning picture of Karen Wethers. The headline, HOA Power Play or Personal Vendetta Sheriff's Pony Death Sparks Outrage and Investigation, was plastered across the front page. The small-town paper was suddenly in high demand, copies selling out across the county. The reaction was swift and decisive. The HOA board, minus Karen, who had suddenly taken an indefinite leave of absence for personal reasons, convened an emergency session, faced with mounting legal pressure, potential lawsuits from residents including Mark, and the utter collapse of their public image. They moved quickly. Within days, Karen Wethers was officially removed from her position on the HOA board by a unanimous vote. The wildlife management zone permit that had led to Biscuit's death was immediately revoked, and a full review of all HOA bylaws and complaint procedures was initiated. The HOA, humbled and reeling, issued a public apology to the Halston family and the wider community. For Karen Wethers, the fall was precipitous. The carefully constructed facade of civic duty and community leadership shattered. Revealing the petty vindictiveness beneath, she became a pariah in her own meticulously curated neighborhood. For sale signs began to appear on lawns in her development. Not just hers, as some residents, disillusioned by the HOA's overreach and internal politics, decided to seek quieter, less regulated pastures. The bonus she had allegedly offered the hunters became a key point in the prosecutor's ongoing investigation into misuse of HOA funds and authority. While she avoided immediate arrest, the threat of legal action loomed large, a dark cloud over her future. Her reign of officious terror was definitively over. Mark watched these developments with a grim sense of satisfaction. Justice, it seemed, was grinding its way forward. Albeit slowly, but his primary concern remained Tommy. The public victory meant little if his son was still lost in grief. One crisp afternoon, a week after Karen's removal, Mark found Tommy sitting by Biscuit's grave under the old oak tree. He wasn't crying, just sitting there, listlessly tossing an acorn into the air. Mark sat down beside him. "It's not fair he's not here," Tommy said softly. His first unsolicited words about Biscuit in days. "No, son, it's not," Mark agreed. "What happened to him was wrong, and the person who caused it is facing the consequences." Tommy looked at his father. "Will it bring Biscuit back?" Mark pulled him close. "No, buddy, nothing can do that. And that's the hardest part. We'll always miss him." He paused. "But do you remember when Biscuit first came here? How scared he was of everything, and you were so patient with him, so gentle. You taught him to trust, to not be afraid." Tommy nodded, a flicker of memory in his eyes. "You have a good heart, Tommy." Mark continued. "Biscuit knew that, and what those people did, what Karen Wethers did, it came from a bad place. But our town, our neighbors, they showed us they have good hearts too. They stood up for what was right, for you, and for Biscuit." A few days later, Jed Olson and a group of neighboring farmers arrived at the Halston farm. They weren't empty-handed. In the back of Jed's truck was a young, slightly gangly, but bright-eyed chestnut filly, a lead rope looped loosely around her neck. "Mark, Tommy," Jed said, a warm smile on his weathered face. "We all chipped in, heard there was a vacancy in the paddock. She's no Biscuit, no horse ever could be. But she needs a good home, and a boy with a kind hand. Tommy's eyes, wide with surprise, fixed on the filly. She nickered softly, nudging Jed's hand. He slowly approached, Mark giving him an encouraging nod. Tommy tentatively reached out a hand, and the filly, after a moment's hesitation, stretched her neck and sniffed his fingers, then lipped at his palm gently. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched Tommy's lips, the first genuine smile Mark had seen in weeks. It wasn't a replacement. Mark knew it was a new beginning, a testament to the community's kindness, a step towards healing. The legal proceedings against Karen Wethers would continue for some time, a slow, methodical process. But in Clayton Creek, the verdict was already in. She had abused her power, caused immense pain, and been held accountable by the collective will of a community that valued decency and fairness above petty regulations. Mark Halston, standing on his porch months later, watched Tommy leading the new filly, now named Hope by his son, around the paddock. The laughter that had been absent for so long was finally returning to his boy's voice. The trauma of Biscuit's death would always be a scar, a reminder of a dark day, but it was also a reminder of his own strength as a father, of a community's capacity for compassion and justice, and of the enduring power of a child's love for an animal. The sheriff had faced down corruption, not with a gun, but with truth and the unwavering support of his town. The father had helped his son navigate an ocean of grief, guiding him towards a shore of healing. The farm, once a place of shattered peace, was slowly finding its rhythm again. The gentle nicker of a young horse, a promise of brighter days. The reign of the HOA tyrant was over. The spirit of Clayton Creek, resilient and just, had prevailed. Mark took a deep breath of the clean country air. Justice had been served, not just in a courtroom, but in the heart of his community, and most importantly, in the mending heart of his son.